Where's all my Lord of the Rings fans? Woo! And a shout. That's awesome. Fantastic. Yeah, we too, my wife and I both. Some of you are, hardcore on this, and so I'll wade with some caution. I am no literary critic, okay? But I will say that I find one of the most interesting plot threads in the whole story, The Lord of the Rings, is the conflict that Sam and Frodo have over the character Gollum. You know what I'm talking about? As you know, Frodo and Sam are deep into the most dangerous journey imaginable. Why? Because one does not simply walk into Mordor. They pick up a companion and guide, maybe the last one that anyone would choose. Of course, I'm talking about Gollum. If you know, you know. By this point in the story, Gollum is literally consumed by desire for the very thing that they are trying to destroy. Of course, I'm talking about the Ring of Power. Can't believe I'm explaining the story to you. If you've been living in a cave, you don't know it. Play along. Sam, who is kind and loyal, otherwise quite optimistic. Like if there's ever a glass half full type of guy, it's Samwise Gamgee. He wants nothing to do with Gollum, right? But Frodo, as a ring bearer himself, is perhaps trying to hold on to his own humanity, hobbitanity. Frodo, trying to hold on to his own hobbitnessiness, decides to extend grace to Gollum, knowing full well the risk of doing so, and in a masterful, honestly masterful literary fashion, that grace given to one who in no way deserves it ends up being both the thing that could kill them and the very thing that ultimately saves the mission. And then the eagles come, tale as old as time. Am I right? Okay, the question that I would like us all to sit with this morning is, what does it actually look like to extend grace to someone who might not deserve it? What's at stake if we do? What's at stake if we don't? Because if I had to guess, I would guess that some of you perhaps have felt trapped inside of a story like that of your own, where you're not really sure what the right thing to do is with this character in your life who seems to be following you around or whose path keeps colliding with your own. And maybe you've thought a lot about the cost that showing grace might have on your own life or your own story. So we're going to talk about that this morning, and I'll ask you all to think about who is that person for you. And if there's not somebody right now, think of a time in your life where somebody let you down. It could be large, it could be small, but think of a time in your life someone let you down. I'm not talking about a stranger. You know that feels different. That's a different thing. I'm talking about someone you trusted, someone who was supposed to show up for you and who didn't. Because I think most of us, if we tried, we could probably come up with a list, right? Like there would be a whole list of people who fit that description. It's actually not all that hard, because even on a good day, relationships can be complicated. Sadly, people aren't always all that reliable. That's just the truth. So it's not really that hard to justify the reasons why you have people on your list and why those people deserve to be on your list. And I just wanted to start by acknowledging that. In case there's somebody here who is maybe a little bruised by all this thing and you need to hear me say out loud, I'll say it out loud. People suck. Yeah, I mean, not all people, obviously, but sometimes it feels like a lot of people. Like they gossip and they lie and they judge you and they don't know anything about you or about the situation that you're going through. People betray your confidence. They betray your friendship. When they should come to your defense, they stay silent, right? They don't show up at all. I should have added this actually to the paper notes. People suck. Let me count the ways and let you fill in the blanks, right? With all of your own stories of heartbreak and betrayal. The point is this: there's a lot of perfectly legitimate, entirely reasonable reasons for you to put people on a list like that, and all the emotions that are now rising up inside of you that I've sort of dredged up from the past where you shoved them down, of all of the exactly reasonable, responsible ways that people feel when somebody fails them. In fact, I think there was a theologian, Augustine, who said, "In the beginning, man's nature was created without fault and without sin. However, human nature, in which we are all born from Adam till now, requires a physician, because people suck," or something like that. Augustine, don't quote me on that. Friends, these are all the very real obstacles that grace has to overcome every time. If you have a Bible, go ahead and flip to Acts chapter 15. My notes are on the Bible app for those of you who prefer that. Acts chapter 15, while you're finding your way there, this is also the same chapter you find the Council of Jerusalem. Remember, this is where they actually had to wrestle as a young community of faith with some of the foundational theological questions about grace. We talked a bit about that last week. Like, how much of the law were Gentile Christians expected to observe in order to follow Jesus? That's in Acts chapter 15. We're going to jump to Acts 15:36 if you're following along. 36. It says, "Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, 'Let's go back and visit the believers in all of the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing.' Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia." I said that wrong, Pamphylia, and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Okay, let me spill the tea here. During Paul's first missionary journey, we were talking AD 46 to AD 48 or something like that. Paul and Barnabas and John Mark sailed from Paphos across the Mediterranean Sea, and they landed in the port city of Perga, which is the cultural and religious capital of this region called Pamphylia, which is sort of the south coast of modern-day Turkey. Before they pushed inland, we're told that John Mark quits, like abruptly quits. He abandons the mission, he abandons his friends, takes his ball, and he goes back home to Jerusalem. And we're not told why. Like, we don't have any reason why he would do such a thing. Acts 13:13 just says that John left them and returned to Jerusalem. Like, maybe he was tired. Like, it had already been a lot of miles by ship. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he was sick. Like, we really have no idea. But John Mark bails. Paul and Barnabas kind of probably discouraged, probably frustrated, but whatever, decide to continue on without him. And they do, up through the rugged Kestros Valley, up through the Taurus Mountains to reach the Anatolian Plateau in Pisidian Antioch. Now, yesterday, Graham and I went to Ancaster to do just a single 13-mile loop of this course that I'm supposed to do in May, like a bunch of times. And it was muddy, and it was gross, and it was uphill and downhill and uphill. It was punishing, and it was awesome. But for Paul and Barnabas, this was a grueling 120 to 150-mile uphill trek that would take regular thru hikers like 10 days on foot. Some of you know me. Yes, I looked up on Strava to see if I could find the route that they took. I couldn't. There isn't exactly a Strava route for their unpaved first century path through Taurus, through the Taurus Mountains. There is, though, some paths that people still take, the Lycian Way or what's called the Pisidian Heritage Trail. That means you could take your next vacation, you know, the thing you do for fun, and you could travel the same harrowing journey up to Pisidian Antioch and experience some of the fun that they did. between 14 and 16,000 feet of total elevation gain over the similar distances. Remember, your holiday will be at altitude between 6,500 and 10,000 feet above sea level. That means the air will be thin and arid. You will be starving for oxygen all the time before finally descending back down to 4,000 feet, the level of the upper plateau of Pisidian Alta. Sound like fun? Honestly, is anybody blaming John Mark for saying, yeah, no, I'm going home, right? And nobody's blaming him. Well, except for Paul. Paul's blaming him. John Mark goes home, and Paul and Barnabas are like, dude, we were just about to have some fun. So they go on the trek. Along the way, there are little Jewish settlements. These are the places that are prime for them to go and share about Jesus. They could preach, they could teach, they could find rest and hospitality, so they could slowly work their way up through the mountains to Pisidian Antioch. They actually end up planting a bunch of churches on this trip. It's really successful. It's fantastic. So let me just kind of walk you through the map a little bit. First, they go to Pisidian Antioch. After being run out of town, true story, they flee 90 miles southeast to Iconium. Good times, right? And from Iconium, they walk roughly 20 to 30 miles to Lystra. Do you remember this story? In Lystra is where Paul's dragged out of the city and stoned, left for dead. Now, it turns out he was not dead. He was only mostly dead. And so they actually get up, and he's like, yeah, let's keep going. This is fun. So they travel another 30 to 40 miles to Derbe, which is the furthest point in the journey that they would take on this trip. And all told, let me do the math for you, one-way distance from the port in Pamphylia to their final stop in Derbe is now pushing 300 miles. 300 miles. This is the land portion. Remember, they had already gone 1,000 miles by sea and Cyprus and all that. Big time. Here's what's cool. What makes this so incredible is what happened next. If you can see Derbe, if they were to travel, there's a little thing called the Cilician Gates. They could have gone this way and relatively safely found their way back to Antioch and would have been fine. They would have been home at Syrian Antioch, not to be confused with Pisidian Antioch, back at their home church. This is the Antioch that you read about where they said, set apart Paul and Barnabas for me, etc., 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 etc. Instead, Acts 14:21 says that they chose to turn around and retrace their steps, right? Good times. So they walked the 300 miles back to Lystra, the city where they had just stoned Paul. Iconium, Pisidian Antioch, and then they faced the quad-busting 120-mile descent back through the Kestros Valley, back to Pamphylia. Why would they do that, Daryl? Like, why would they do that? They did it for the love of the church. They did it to strengthen and encourage all of these new disciples that they had met. Something I didn't mention, something you may not have known. Why would they go here? Do you remember the story of in Acts chapter 2, the birth of the church in the upper room and the pouring out of the Holy Spirit? Remember that there were people of every nation, tribe, and tongue listening to them saying, why do we hear you sharing this message about Jesus in our own tongue? Do you remember that part of the story? There were men from Pamphylia at that time. It's like God sowing a seed for something he was going to do years later through Paul and Barnabas. And they would have had no way of knowing that, hearing and seeing God putting the pieces together in faithfulness, how God plans to pour his love into our lives in 100 ways that we have no idea about until they happen. That's why they did it. They did it because they knew that God was going to encourage and wanted to encourage these new disciples. They did it to appoint elders and leaders so that these churches could remain steadfast and sure throughout the next season in their lives. So again, total round trip, there and back again, Pamphylia to Derbe, back to Pamphylia, pushing 600 miles. Like wild stuff. And all of this is not just Daryl's nerding out. This is actually important to our context for our text this morning. Acts chapter 15:36 says, sometime later. You better believe it was sometime later. Like people who run ultras of that length, their toenails fall off. Like they get stress fractures. Paul got stoned. Some people never recover from a trip like that. Not physically, not emotionally. Think about all the things that were happening. They felt many times like they could die on the side of a trail and no one would find them. Good times. I'm just saying, you need time to recover from a trip like that. But sometime later, Paul looks at Barnabas. You thinking what I'm thinking? And Barnabas does one of those sighs, and he shakes his head, and then nods. And then Paul says, we should go back. We should go back. We should do all of that again. Let's go back, visit the believers in all of the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. I love this part of the story. This is what they call type 2 fun. Have you heard of type 2 fun? Yeah, absolutely. Type 2 fun is those experiences that are pure suffering. You are exhausted and freezing. You are covered in mud. You are questioning all of your life choices. But once those experiences are over, you can't wait to do it all again. That's what we're talking about. So in Acts 15:36, what I don't want you to miss, it had been a couple years, okay, since the end of their trip. And Paul is by then itching to get back. Have any of you seen those memes? Anyone can invite you to go for a drink, but a true friend invites you to suffer. Yeah, that's what's going on in this story. But Barnabas is like, let's do it. Let's go. Barnabas is all in. Verse 37, remember, we're still in the text. Barnabas wanted to take John Mark with them too. 38, but Paul did not think it was wise to take him because he had deserted them last time. See, I know to Paul it felt like it was just yesterday, but remember, it had been years. Like it had been a couple years. This whole beef with John Mark was not fresh. It wasn't fresh at all. Verse 39 says, they had such a sharp disagreement. So I have a commentary set by N.T. Wright, former Bishop of Canterbury, and in classic British kind of way, he says, there was such a huge row which resulted in them splitting up. I love that. The Greek word is paroxysmos, which is still a term that you can actually stumble across in a medical context. A paroxysm is a sudden and severe spasm or a seizure or a convulsion. What's the point? This wasn't a spat. This was not a wee tiff or a squabble. Paul blew his top. He laid an egg. This was a dust-up, a Donnybrook, a genuine brouhaha. To Paul, this was the worst idea ever, and he was mad. It dug up all of this anger that he was still carrying from the first time John Mark bailed in Pamphylia. But to Barnabas, remember Barnabas' name literally means son of encouragement. To Barnabas, it felt like an outsized reaction. He's like, whoa, Paul, where did that come from? Like that was years ago and you're still wound up about that. Listen, here's what I don't want you to miss though. Paul's position is not entirely petty. It's actually not. It's reasonable, maybe even responsible. John Mark couldn't hack it the first time. What makes you think he can hack it now? Like, Daryl, you don't put someone in a high-stakes role after they've already shown that when the going gets tough and the cost gets real, they're going to quit. Like, that's not who you put in those kind of roles. Like, isn't that what many of you would have thought if you were in Paul's position? Like, the reasoning is sound, right? Maybe we should take a poll. How many of you are siding with Barnabas? And you're like, no, give John Mark a chance. Anybody siding with Barnabas? Couple, 1, 2, couple. What about how many of you are with Paul? Like, no, I'm not sure he's the guy. Like, I'm not sure he's the guy for that. Yeah, some of you are more cautious, you're more skeptical. And listen, this is the challenge of grace. This is the challenge of grace. Paul's resistance is not unreasonable. It's not even unusual. We actually find a bunch of examples of this kind of thing in the New Testament, and they're not really from bad people. Remember, the entire Jerusalem church was afraid after Paul's conversion. Do you remember that? Yeah, absolutely. They had good reason. This David Goggins of a man had been hunting Christians, breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He had been arresting people, sending them to their death. Those people who follow the way were being hunted by Paul, this character, until Jesus gently knocks him off his donkey and reveals himself to Paul in Acts chapter 9. So Paul the bounty hunter becomes Paul the Christian. You guys remember that story? Who does God send to show grace to Paul? Who does God send to show grace to this Gollum? It's Acts chapter 9. Barnabas. Yeah, it would have looked like recklessness to people who had lost friends to Paul's persecution, but Barnabas did it anyways. In Galatians 2, Peter stops eating with Gentile believers when the demographic of his church starts to change. Now, Peter should have known better. Like, Peter was the one who had that vision of Cornelius and all the food and all that kind of stuff, but the social pressure of extending grace to the wrong people was enough that Peter flinched. And Paul and Peter had a bit of a brouhaha again. Paul loved to have brouhahas, I guess. And Paul said, dude, you got to get straight with this. You got to start treating the Gentiles fairly again. And of course, don't forget Luke 15, the story of the prodigal son. The older brother, he was faithful, he was obedient, he was present, but he's also not all that quick to forgive his little brother, right? When the father runs down the road to meet his returning brother, the older son's kind of standing, later in the story, outside the party, and is kind of furious because his accounting was accurate. Right? His accounting was accurate. His father's response looked wrong. It looked wrong. Every time, if you're taking notes, write this down. Every time grace lands on a specific person, someone nearby calls it a mistake. That's it. Someone with legitimate standing, legitimate hurt, legitimate concern says, this is too much, or this feels too soon, or this is just simply not deserved. That pattern doesn't automatically make those objectors villains. That's not what I'm saying. It just means grace is always going to appear illogical. That's what grace is, right? That's what grace is, because it's always given to those who are undeserving. That's the definition of grace. It is always without regard for merit. And most of us at one point or another are going to take the side of that other brother. We're going to struggle with it sometimes. Sure we are, standing outside the party, wondering why the Father's running. The instinct to withhold grace is almost universal. Why? Once bitten, twice shy. Because we've all been let down. Remember? People suck. Oh yeah, Daryl, how could I forget? Yeah, but this is exactly what grace has to push through every time. This is what it has to overcome every time. Maybe you recognize some of these people on the slide. Some of you have a friend who constantly cancels plans at the last minute, forgets to text back. So you show up and they don't, they ghost you. Your instinct to say, you know what, I'm kind of done inviting them, right? Let them reach out to me the next time they want to hang out. But grace says, you know what, I'm going to invite them anyway. Like, yes, zero pressure and honestly very little expectation, but I do want them to know that they're still wanted. That's what grace does. That's what grace does. What about you when you cover for a colleague at work who's always dropping the ball and they never even say thank you? Why are you all looking at Kendra right now? Like, no, listen, no, she's the one always covering for us. Don't get me wrong. When Shane and I drop the ball, Kendra's always the one. Okay, forget it. Sorry, Kendra. Some of you have experienced that. We're not naming any names this morning. You're covering for a colleague who drops the ball, they don't say thank you, and the next week what happens? They're drowning again. Yeah, there's a type. You're tempted to say, sounds like a you problem the next time they're in trouble, right? You made your bed, you sleep in it, but grace says, all right, pull up a chair, and then you help them get out of the mess, right? You help them because that's what grace does. Parents, what about you? How about all the times you're met with eye rolls and one-word answers and slam doors and all this, and your instinct is to match that teenage drama with a little drama of your own, and you can bring the drama as good as teenagers can bring the drama. You can raise, when they raise their voice, you can like, maybe I'll go raise my voice too. But grace says, maybe you should give them a pass sometime. Listen to me, parents. Not every time, teenagers, but sometimes. Why? Because that's what grace does. That's what grace does. And I realize, I know what you're thinking. I realize that every one of these examples makes you want to roll your eyes at me because people suck, and right now I'm the one looking like a sucker. You're like, yeah, Daryl, you have fun with your grace. Friends, in a world obsessed with justice or karma or comeuppance, grace makes you look like a chump. When you extend grace, people don't call you holy. They say you lack self-respect. But I'm telling you, my favorite stories aren't revenge plots where people finally get what's coming to you. They are redemption stories where people get the grace they don't deserve, and it changes their story somehow. That's what I'm talking about. Like, I'm glad the Ring of Power got destroyed and the Age of Orcs never came and all that kind of stuff. But I'm sad that poor Smeagol never got to find freedom from the curse, aren't you? Because someday your own humanity might catch up with you, and you'll be praying for someone foolish enough to risk looking like a sucker and coming to your aid or giving you a second chance. Someday it might be you who needs grace. And I've been the guy who needed grace sometimes. I've been that guy sometimes. Barnabas is like Kenny Rogers. He knows when to hold him. He knows when to fold him. And so Barnabas decides to take a risk and extend grace to John Mark. And John Mark takes it. He takes his chance. He's not going to mess this one up. And he joins Barnabas, and they go on a trek of their own. Paul goes in a different direction. And at this moment, friends, I think Barnabas sees grace more clearly. I think he does. I think Barnabas gets grace more than Paul gets grace. Remember, I called last week Paul the preeminent theologian of grace because Paul talks about grace more than anyone else in the New Testament. I think Barnabas gets grace more than Paul today. Grace says, forgive one another just as God in Christ forgave you. Think about that text. It doesn't set the bar at what the other person deserves. It sets the bar at what you received. Yeah. Grace says, don't wait until the person deserves it or is adequately remorseful. Romans 5 makes the timing clear. God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died. Like, it's not after we cleaned up ourselves, not after we proved that failure was just a one-time thing. While we were still the problem, that's when God shows grace. Barnabas understood grace. He had already seen grace work too, hadn't he? Including, remember that time, Paul? I wonder if they brought that up in the argument. Paul, don't you remember that time I stood up for you? Like, don't you remember when he vouched for the man who had been killing Christians before Paul had any track record that he could point to of his changed life? No, and now he wants to do it again. Barnabas wants to do it again for Mark. And I know some of you think Barnabas is naive. I know some of you think Barnabas is a pushover. But I'm telling you, Barnabas just believes that the scandal of grace is a cross worth carrying. And he learned that from Jesus. He did. He's willing to look like a chump so that Mark can get a second chance. I like this story. Now, if you need to have me say this out loud, I will. Grace does not ignore failure. That's not what grace does. It doesn't ignore failure. It just refuses to let failure get the last word. Grace doesn't erase the past, all those things that those people did. It doesn't erase that. It just creates some space for God to write a new future or to rewrite the future. Barnabas is just taking a longer view of human development. Sometimes people take time, and we got to give them the time that they need for their lives to really change. Barnabas saw who Mark was becoming, not just what Mark had done that one time. And that's not sentimentality. It's not. It's actually a specific theological decision about what grace does with a person over time. We talked about that last week too. Grace isn't just a transaction that you complete when you're converted, when you first believe in Jesus. It's a posture that you carry to every relationship. Yeah, but Daryl, people suck. No, but you got to carry grace as a posture into every relationship. I'm talking about the sibling who borrowed money and never paid it back when you were 18, and you're not 18 anymore. A relative who said something at a family gathering and you just can't unhear it. Yeah, that guy too. A spouse who always is emotionally checked out. A partner who undermines you publicly and then privately apologizes. Yeah, that one sucks. It just doesn't feel like it's quite enough, does it? Yeah, what about the ex who hurt you and now needs something from you? What about the colleague who takes credit for your work, an employee who violates your trust, and then when they leave, they ask you if you can write them a glowing reference letter? Yeah, what about the leader who threw you under the bus to protect themselves? Yeah, I could keep going. In fact, you could keep going. Like your list, I'm sure, is just as good as my list. And what makes all of these things hard is not that we don't or we've stopped believing in forgiveness. That's not what makes them hard. It's that trust was broken with someone specific, and grace is asking you, nagging you, bothering you, pulling on your chest, saying, isn't it time you reopened something that you closed for a good reason? It's saying, you got to reopen that. You got to go back to that. You got to call them. You got to do something again. You're like, but God, I put boundaries up. I wrote that one off. That's grace. Grace is extended in messy situations. And it almost always looks wrong to somebody who's watching from the outside in. That's not a bug. That's actually a feature. That's what grace is, remember. That's what grace is. And sometimes we all need grace. We do. We all need grace. And what do I mean when I say that? Forgiveness for our mistakes and misdeeds. We all need that. Kindnesses that we don't deserve, we all need that. A chance to rebuild trust by being trustworthy again. We all need that. And I'm telling you, my friends, my favorite stories are not revenge plots where people get what's coming to them. They are the redemption stories where people get the grace that they don't deserve. Is that just me? Some of you should flip to 2 Timothy chapter 4. After many trials and many more miles, Paul finds himself 1,000,000 miles from where he started. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul is imprisoned in Rome. He is writing what he thinks will be his last letter. He's awaiting his own execution, not a trial he expects to win. These are deeply vulnerable words that we're hearing from the Apostle Paul. He says, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering." David Goggins has got nothing left, right? He's saying, the time for my departure is near. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. And now there is in store for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. Not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. It's like he gets just a little second wind of strength. He wants to give one more bit of encouragement to his young apprentice, Timothy. He says, "Do your best to come to me quickly. For Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me." Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry. Come on! This is a good story. This is what I'm talking about. Friends, it is never too late to extend grace to somebody who hurt you. It's never too late. There's no better way that you can spend your last days on this earth than extending grace, showing grace, pouring grace, making grace phone calls, having grace conversations, having grace cups of coffee and grace meals. There's no better story that you can write with your life and your last ounce of strength. Whether they failed or bailed or something worth. Because your other choice is you can take that hurt to your grave. Or you can give away some of the grace that you got when Jesus first found you. That's what he's talking about. This river of life that flows out of us. God shows you a bit of grace, and then you have all the grace you need to extend to the people who hurt you. What Jesus gave you is all you could possibly need to show others grace, to forgive others for that hurt and that wound. I'm just telling you, grace is a better story. And when people like you or churches like Pathway open wide the doors to people who we know are going to bring history and hurts, and no explanation will be required, when people like you and churches like this save a seat for somebody who they notice always sits alone, maybe that person's afraid that others will find out who they are and what they've been through. When people like you and churches like this set a place at the table for people who have tried repeatedly to burn bridges with you. And when people like you in churches like this make sure that in their church, people who have failed, bailed, or something worse can always find a Barnabas. I'm just telling you, that's a good story. And grace doesn't forget or erase the past, but it does create space for God to write new chapters in people's lives. And I don't know if you found this, but I found that that kind of community is rare. But it's what the watching world is desperately looking for. So let's be that, okay? Let's pray. God, would you help us to be people of grace? And we know full well the challenge and the risk of that. But we also believe that it's a better story because we've seen it, Jesus, in you. The cross that you carried, the fact that you looked down on the people who had betrayed you and denied you and were literally in the process of crucifying you, and you said, Father, forgive them because they do not know what they're doing. Like it takes your breath away to see that kind of grace in that kind of an extreme situation. Your love takes our breath away. So we want to be the kind of people who can give it away so that all of us can be people who've experienced your amazing grace. Thank you for what you've done. Thank you for what you're going to do in our community. And we pray that you would be honored. In Jesus' name, amen.